Before chemicals ever entered a garden, before shelves of brightly labeled bottles promised control and certainty, gardening was shaped by something much quieter. It was shaped by observation. Knowledge did not arrive printed on packaging or explained through instructions. It arrived through seasons, mistakes, repetition, and memory. What people grew and how they grew, it was not based on products, but on relationships between plants, soil, weather, and time. If you walked into a garden 300 years ago, it would not look impressive by modern standards. There would be no uniform rows, no identical plants spaced with mathematical precision. The soil would not be bare and exposed. There would be a mix of textures, heights, and growth stages all existing together. Some plants would be there for food, others for soil, others simply because they belonged there. Gardening was not about maximizing yield in isolation. It was about stability over time. People did not ask what to add to the soil. They asked what the soil was already doing. They paid attention to how water moved, how quickly ground dried, where frost settled, and which plants returned each year without help. These details mattered because there was no backup system. If a crop failed, there was no store to compensate. Gardening knowledge was survival knowledge, and it was treated accordingly. Soil was not seen as an inert medium that needed constant correction. It was treated as a living system that responded to care and neglect. Organic matter was returned to the ground not because it was labeled as fertilizer, but because it was the only logical place for it to go. Leaves fell, stems broke, roots decayed, and all of it stayed close to where it came from. The garden fed itself slowly, and people learned to recognize the signs of balance and imbalance long before they could measure nutrients. Plants were not grown alone unless there was a reason. Certain combinations were avoided, others repeated year after year. Not because of charts, but because experience showed which plants helped each other survive. Some shaded the soil, some loosened it. Some returned nutrients. Some attracted insects that controlled others. These patterns were not framed as techniques. They were simply the way gardens worked. Before chemicals, pest control did not mean elimination. It meant tolerance. Gardeners expected losses and planned around them. They understood that removing every insect often created bigger problems later. Instead of reacting aggressively, they observed cycles. When pests increased, predators followed. When one plant suffered, another compensated. The garden was a system, not a battlefield. Propagation followed the same logic. Plants were multiplied using what was nearby. Cuttings were rooted in damp soil, sand, or water infused with plant material. Certain trees were known to encourage growth. Certain seasons were avoided. Failures were accepted as information, not mistakes. Over time, gardeners learned which plants wanted to live and which required more care. Those that thrived became staples. Gardening books, when they existed at all, did not offer instructions in the modern sense. They described observations. They recorded what worked in specific places, under specific conditions. They assumed the reader would adapt the information rather than follow it blindly. Knowledge was local, contextual, and flexible. There was no expectation that one method would work everywhere. Fertility came from rotation, rest, and residue. Fields and beds were not pushed continuously. They were allowed to recover. Plants that improved soil were grown intentionally, not harvested aggressively. Livestock, where present, contributed manure that returned nutrients slowly and unevenly, mimicking natural systems. Nothing was measured precisely, but everything was noticed. The most important difference between then and now was not the absence of chemicals, but the presence of patience. Gardening operated on longer timelines. Improvements were measured in years rather than weeks. Soil was built slowly. Knowledge accumulated gradually. Success was defined by consistency, not perfection. When something worked, it was passed down. When it failed, it was adjusted or abandoned. There was no external authority declaring best practices. The garden itself was the authority. Over generations, this created systems that were resilient, adaptable, and deeply tied to place. This was gardening before chemicals took over. Not simpler, but slower. Not primitive, but attentive. It relied less on inputs and more on understanding. And while it lacked the appearance of control modern gardening promises, it possessed something far more valuable: stability. As gardening knowledge moved into written form during the medieval and early modern periods, it did not immediately lose its connection to observation. Monasteries, estates, and farming communities recorded what they saw, not what they were told. Early gardening texts focused less on instructions and more on conditions. They described soil types, seasonal timing, plant behavior, and local adaptation. A method was never presented as universal. It was offered as something that worked in a particular place, under particular circumstances, and expected to be adjusted. Monasteries played a crucial role in preserving this kind of plant knowledge. Monks were not commercial growers. Their gardens existed to feed communities, produce medicine, and maintain stability over long periods. They paid close attention to which plants improved soil, which ones returned year after year, and which combinations reduced loss. Plant-based fertility, natural propagation, and reuse of organic material were not considered alternatives. They were simply how gardening functioned when nothing else existed. On farms, this knowledge was rarely written down at all. It was inherited. Children learned by watching. Families repeated what worked and quietly discarded what didn't. There was no incentive to overproduce in a single season if it compromised the next one. Gardening and farming were not separate disciplines. They were part of the same rhythm. Soil rested when it needed to. Plants were chosen for reliability, not appearance. Losses were expected, but collapse was avoided. Even as early scientific thinking began to influence agriculture, the focus remained on understanding rather than control. Improvements meant better observation, not replacement. Tools became more refined, but the underlying logic stayed the same. Plants were partners in the process, not problems to be solved. That balance would not last forever, but at this stage, it was still intact. The shift did not happen because traditional gardening failed. It happened because a new idea took hold that nature could be improved by control. As industrialization spread in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, agriculture and gardening were pulled into the same mindset shaping factories and machines. Efficiency became the goal. Predictability became the standard. Variability, once accepted as part of working with living systems, began to look like a problem that needed fixing. Early chemical fertilizers and pesticides arrived offering something that traditional methods could not promise: immediate, visible results. Plants grew faster, pests disappeared quickly, yields increased in the short term. To many gardeners and educators, this felt like progress. It was easier to measure, easier to teach, and easier to replicate across different regions. A bottle could deliver the same result regardless of local conditions, and that uniformity was appealing. Gardening education began to change accordingly. Instead of teaching how to read soil, books taught what to apply to it. Instead of learning plant behavior, gardeners were taught how to correct plant problems. Observation was slowly replaced by intervention. The garden was no longer a system to understand, but a process to manage. This transition did not require anyone to abandon older methods outright. They were simply no longer emphasized. As new products entered the market, they took up space in books, courses, and demonstrations. Plant-based techniques, seasonal patience, and soil-building practices were not argued against. They were just crowded out. By the time chemicals became commonplace, an entire generation of gardeners had been trained to believe that successful gardening depended on external inputs. What had once been knowledge passed through experience was replaced by instructions passed through packaging. The garden became quieter, more controlled, and less forgiving. And most people never realized what had been lost in the exchange. What disappeared was not just a set of techniques, but a way of seeing the garden. Skills that relied on long observation slowly became unnecessary in a system built around quick correction. Gardeners no longer needed to notice subtle changes in soil texture or plant behavior if a product could be applied to force a response. Over time, the ability to read the garden weakened, not because people were less capable, but because they were no longer required to practice it. As chemical inputs became routine, gardens also became more fragile. When success depends on regular intervention, the margin for error narrows. Miss an application, and problems appear quickly. Soil that once built itself through organic cycles began to rely on external feeding. Pests that were once balanced by diversity learned to rebound faster. The garden looked productive, but it no longer functioned independently. Many gardeners sensed this shift without being able to name it. Gardening felt more complicated than it should. Costs increased, instructions multiplied, mistakes carried heavier consequences. What had once been forgiving became precise. What had once been adaptive became rigid. The garden still produced food, but it demanded more attention, more products, and more correction than before. The quiet loss was not productivity, but confidence. Gardeners stopped trusting what they saw and started trusting what they were told. Knowledge moved outward, away from the soil and into manuals. And without realizing it, gardening became something that happened to the garden rather than something that happened with it. What we are seeing now is not a rejection of modern gardening, but a correction. As more gardeners face rising costs, declining soil quality, and systems that feel increasingly fragile, attention naturally turns back to methods that once made gardens resilient rather than dependent. Old practices resurface not because they are romantic, but because they solve problems that products cannot. They work slowly, quietly, and with fewer consequences when things go wrong. What gardening looked like before chemicals took over was not perfect, but it was grounded. It relied on understanding rather than intervention, cooperation rather than control. Plants were allowed to behave like plants. Soil was allowed to function like soil. Knowledge lived in observation, not instruction. And while progress brought powerful tools, it also narrowed the way gardeners were taught to think. The return of these older methods does not mean going backward. It means remembering that gardening was never meant to be a constant act of correction. It was meant to be a relationship, one where the gardener learns, adapts, and works within the limits of living systems instead of trying to override them. When that balance is restored, gardening becomes quieter, more forgiving, and more stable again. The plants never forgot how to grow without chemicals. The soil never forgot how to rebuild itself. Only the practice changed. And now, slowly, that practice is finding its way back. Not through instruction manuals, but through people noticing what still works when everything else feels too complicated. That is what gardening looked like before chemicals took over, and it may be closer to what